This is part 77 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss creating custom action filters. Let's take a step back and understand what actions and action filters are. Actions are public methods in a controller. Action filters are attributes that can be applied either on a controller or on a controller action method, which allows us to add pre and post processing logic to the action methods. So in simple terms, an action filter allows us to execute some custom code either just before an action method is executed or immediately after an action method completes execution. And in the previous sessions of this video series, we have discussed about some of the built-in action filters. So as you can see here, we discussed about authorize attribute, handle error attribute, etc. Let's create a custom action filter, and the custom action filter that we are going to build should log the information that you can see here to a text file. So for example, let's say when an action method is executed, then we want to log the name of the controller in which that action method is present, and the name of the action method itself, and the execution time. And if there is an exception executing that action method, then we want to log the exception message and the time of the exception. So the output has to be like this, as you can see here. Let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have a blank ASP.NET MVC4 application. Let's add a controller and let's name it Home Controller. Now before we actually build a custom action filter, let's understand the different types of action filters that are available in ASP.NET MVC. Now the action filters in ASP.NET MVC can be classified into 4 types. Authorization filters. So basically these filters are used to implement authentication and authorization. Okay. Now the filters of this type implement authorization filter. So if you remember, we discussed about authorize attribute. So if I right click on this attribute and if we go to the definition on that, notice that it implements authorization filter interface. And if we go to the definition on this interface, look at that, there's one method called onAuthorizations. So you can tap into this method and write your custom code. And keep in mind, the authorization filter runs before any other filter. And an example of the built-in authorization filters are authorize attribute, require HTTPS attribute, which we discussed in the previous sessions. And another type of action filters are action filters, which implement action filter. Now if you look at output cache attribute, now this output cache attribute doesn't directly implement this action filter. Instead, it implements action filter attribute. It derives from action filter attribute abstract class. So this is an abstract class, and this class implements action filter. Okay, and if you look at this interface, it has got 2 methods, on action executing and on action executed. So this method runs just before an action method is executed, and this one runs immediately after an action method is executed. So we can tap into these, we can override these methods and then plug in our own custom code that we want to execute in the different stages of the processing pipeline. Okay, so the next filter types are result filter types. Basically they implement result filter. So if you look at this action filter attribute, it also implements result filter. So this interface has got 2 methods, on result executing and on result executed. So this on result executing method runs before an action result is produced, and on result executed method runs immediately after the action result is produced. Again, if you want to add some logic before an action result is produced, then you can override this method. Or if you want to execute some custom logic immediately after the action result is produced, then we can override this function. And the final type of filters are exception filters. So they implement exception filter, and an example of this is handle error attribute, which we discussed in the previous session. So if you look at handle error attribute, So if we right click on this one and go to the definition, so they implement IExceptionFilter. So if I right click on that and go to the definition, look at that, there's one method called onException. Again, we can tap into this method and then find out what is the exception that has occurred. You can get the exception message, track, trace, anything about that exception basically. So if you want to add any custom logic when an exception occurs in an application, then probably you can implement this interface. Alright, so now let's go ahead and create our custom action filter. Because the action filter that we are going to create is going to track the execution time and the exception details. Let's call it track execution time, the name of the exception. So let's add a folder and let's name it common. So all our common code is going to go into this folder, and let's add a class file and let's name it track execution time.cs. Now first of all, let's import the required namespaces. We need system.web.mvc. So this class is going to inherit just like our output cache attribute. This class is inheriting from this action filter attribute class, which is an abstract class. This class implements both IActionFilter and IResultFilter. So we want to inherit from that abstract class. So action filter attribute class, and then since we also want to log the exception details, so we need to override onException method, which is basically present in IExceptionFilter interface. So let's go ahead and implement that interface as well. Okay, now we want to log the exception details to a text file. So let's go ahead and add a folder and let's call it maybe data, and then let's add a text file. Click on general and then you should have an option to add a text file. Let's call this data. Okay, so this is the text file to which we will log the information. Alright, now first of all, let's include a private method in this class, and let's call it log execution time, and then we will give it some data, and all this method is going to do is write the data to this text file. And to write to read and write from files, we need to import system.io namespace. So let's go ahead and import that, and then within system.io we have a class called file class, and then there is a method called append all text. So I'm going to use that method, and when we use this method we have to specify the file to which we want to append that text. So the file is present, so we need to use server.mappath function, and to get to that function I'm going to use http context.current.server.mappath. So within the root directory, so tilde indicates root directory, within the root directory we have a data folder, and within that we have a text file called data.txt. So basically we want to write the exception information to that file. And what is the not only the exception information, the execution time as well. And how are we going to get that? It's going to come into this function in the form of a parameter. So let's pass this parameter to this method. So this method is going to take care of logging the information to that text file. Now, since we are inheriting from this action filter attribute abstract class, if you look at this class has actually got this on action executing, on action executed, on result executing, and on result executed, all these methods. And if you remember, these methods gets invoked at different stages in the processing pipeline. Okay, so look at that, all of them are virtual methods, meaning they will have default implementation, but we can override that within our class since we are inheriting from that class. Okay, so the moment I type override and then when I press space, look at that, I get the option to override any of these methods. So on action executing method, which gets invoked just before an action method is executed. So what do I want to do? At this point I want to retrieve the controller name, the action method name. Look at this, we want the output like this. This home is the controller name, welcome is the action method name, and then this is the stage in the processing pipeline. So the action method is about to be executed. So on action executing and the date and time. Okay, so first of all I need the controller name and the action method name. So how do I get the controller name? Look at this, there is a parameter that's coming into this method, so we can use that parameter. And if you look at that filter context, so you have, you know, action descriptor, and then you have action name, which will give us the name of the action method that's about to be executed. Similarly, if you go to controller descriptor, then you have controller name, which will give us the name of the controller. So basically we can use these properties. And to speed things up, I have already typed that code, so let me copy this and paste it right here. So if you look at this, it's a straightforward code, but just to speed things up, you know, I have already typed this. Look at that, /n is basically for new line character. Okay, so start on a new line, and then this piece here gets the controller name, and then to that we are adding, you know, the symbol for you know, a dash and an angle bracket, because we want, after the controller name, we want that symbol there, and then the action method name, and again we're using this one to get the action name, and then again that symbol there, and then the stage within the execution processing pipeline. So we are in action executing, so that's what I'm printing there, on action executing, the method name, and then /t is for a horizontal tab space. So look at that, there's little, you know, tab space there, so that's achieved using that /t, and then a dash, and then to that we are appending the current date and time, and then again we are using \n, which is like a new line character. So whatever we are going to write next will be in its own line. Okay, so what do we need to do now? We need to pass, you know, we are storing the string in this variable message, so we need to pass that to log execution time method. So let's go ahead and pass it to log execution time. So that should log the message to the text file. Okay, now similarly let's go ahead and override the rest of the methods. Override, so on action executed, this gets run immediately after the action method is executed. So all I'm going to do is copy this one and paste it right there. Okay, since we already have a new line character here, I can get rid of this one, and here the stage is on action executed, that is, the action method has just completed execution. Okay, let's go ahead and override now on result executing. So this is just before action result is produced. Let's copy this and paste it right here. Now look at this here, you know, on result executing. So this is a different stage in the processing pipeline. So this filter context object that's coming here, look at the type of the object, result executing context. So at this point we will not have action descriptor property. You know, there's no action descriptor property on that class. Okay, so how do I get the controller name? To get the controller name, we can use route data here. So filter context dot route data dot values, and from the route data you can retrieve the controller name. So what is the key? Controller. So that's going to return the name of the controller. Okay, and similarly if I want the action method name, we use the same expression, but instead of controller we will pass action, and the stage here is on result executing. Alright, And the final method that we need to override is on result executed, which will be fired immediately after the action result is produced. So let's copy this and paste it right there. And the stage here is on result executed. So let's pass that there. And then look at this. This class is also implementing this iExceptionFilter interface, and if you look at this interface, it has got one method onException. So we basically need to provide the implementation for that method. So let's copy that and let's go back to our class and then implement that. So this is going to be a public method, and then when will this method be executed in the processing pipeline? Whenever there is an exception. And if you look at the filter context object here, you will get the exception information. So I have the exception object there, which is coming as a property. So I can retrieve the exception message simply by saying message. If you want stack trace, dot stack trace will give you that. Okay, so you have access to all kinds of information. Alright, so let's copy this one. So again, we are getting the controller name, action method name, and then this, here the message is I want the exception message to be logged, okay, instead of the stage name. So if there is an exception, I want the exception message to be logged. So how do I get hold of the exception message? Use the object that's coming into this one as a parameter. So filter context dot, oh, that's because we are inside so filter context dot exception dot message should give us the message. Alright, and then the last thing that I want to do is look at that, we need a dotted line as well. So here to log execution time method, I'm going to pass the dotted lines. Okay, let's do the same thing if there is an exception. Alright, so now let's go back to our home controller. And let's make this return a string, and let's say index action invoked. That will be returned back. And then let's have another action method, and let's call it maybe welcome. And then here let's actually throw an exception, throw a new exception, and the exception message is going to be maybe something like exception occurred. Okay, now let's decorate these action methods with our track execution time attribute. So the moment I open the bracket and type tr, look at that, I don't get IntelliSense. That's basically because if you look at this track execution time custom action filter that we have built, it's present in a different namespace, MVC demo.common. So let's use that within our home controller. So track execution time. So let's copy that and apply to our welcome method as well. So let's build our solution. Okay, it says build fail. Let's see why it has failed. Let's look at the error list. Okay, somewhere we are missing a comma. All right, there. All right, let's build a solution, and let's navigate to localhost index. So index action method should be invoked, and it should log the information. So it should be successfully executed, and then look at that, I get a message that data.txt file is modified when I click S to all. And if we go back to the data file, look at that, we see the information that we expect. Okay, now let's try to invoke the welcome action And look at that, there is an exception. Obviously, on exception executed should be invoked. Look at that, there's an exception occurred. So on action executing, on action executed, they completed. I mean, immediately after the action has completed execution, there was an exception, and on action on exception occurred, on exception method within our attribute gets called, and then it logs that information to the text file. Okay. And then if you want to read more about the different types of filters available in ASP.NET MVC, then please do visit this link. So here you have a lot of information about the action filters. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.